I found this letter yesterday while cleaning out my attic. The envelope just said, "For me in 10 years." My hands were shaking as I opened it because I remembered the desperate woman who wrote it. I was up there looking for old photo albums, thinking I might finally be ready to sort through some memories from my marriage without falling apart. 10 years had passed since the divorce. 10 years since everything I'd built my life around had crumbled. 10 years since I'd been that woman sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to see any path forward, writing a letter to a future version of herself that she wasn't sure would ever exist. The envelope was tucked inside a box of papers I'd packed in haste during the separation, things I'd grabbed without really looking at, intending to sort through later. But later had become years, and the box had sat untouched, moving with me from that first terrible apartment to the townhouse I'd rented a few years later, to the small house I'd eventually bought. I'd carried this letter through 3 different homes without ever opening it, without even remembering it was there. But yesterday, seeing that envelope, seeing my own handwriting from a decade ago, something inside me went very still. I sat down on the dusty attic floor, held the envelope in my hands, and felt the weight of everything that had happened since the day I'd sealed it. I almost didn't open it. Part of me was afraid of what I'd find inside, afraid of confronting that version of myself who'd been so broken, so lost, so certain her life was over. But I did open it. And as I read, tears streaming down my face, I was overwhelmed by 2 powerful emotions. First, an aching compassion for the woman who'd written these words, the woman who'd been me but felt like someone else entirely now. And second, a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me from there to here, from that desperate darkness to the light and peace I'd somehow managed to find. The letter began simply, "Dear future me, if you're reading this, it means you survived. I hope that's true. Right now, I remember writing those words. I remember the weight of them, the genuine uncertainty about whether I'd make it through what felt like an unsurvivable loss. My marriage of 18 years had just ended. Not in the way I'd always feared it might, with infidelity or abuse or some dramatic betrayal, but in a way that was somehow worse, with the slow, painful realization that we'd grown into strangers who no longer loved each other, no longer even liked each other, who looked across the dinner table and saw only disappointment and resignation. Michael had been my college sweetheart. We'd married young, built what I'd thought was a solid life together. 2 children, a nice house in a good neighborhood, careers we were proud of. From the outside, we'd looked perfect, but inside our marriage, there had been a growing emptiness, a silence that had started as comfortable and gradually became suffocating. We'd stopped talking about anything that mattered. We'd stopped touching, except in passing. We'd become business partners, managing a household, rather than lovers or friends, or anything resembling a partnership of hearts. The divorce had been civil, which somehow made it worse. No dramatic fights, no clear villain, just 2 people admitting they'd failed at the most important commitment of their lives. We divided assets fairly, agreed on custody arrangements for our children who were thankfully almost adults, signed papers with efficient lawyers in sterile conference rooms. And then I'd moved into a cramped apartment alone, and Michael had started dating someone new almost immediately, and I'd fallen completely apart. At 42 years old, I'd felt like my life was over. I'd failed at marriage. I'd disappointed my children, who'd tried to hide it but were clearly devastated. I'd lost my best friend, even though that friendship had been hollow for years. I'd lost my identity as someone's wife, as part of a couple, as a woman who'd successfully adulted. I was starting over at an age when I'd thought I'd be settled, secure, confident in who I was and where I belonged. But I wasn't any of those things. I was lost and terrified and convinced I'd never be okay again. That's the woman who wrote the letter I was holding. That's the woman whose words I was reading 10 years later, from a place so different she couldn't have imagined it. The next line said, "I'm writing this at 2 a.m. because I can't sleep anymore. I haven't slept properly in weeks. Every time I close my eyes, I see everything I've lost." I did remember that. The insomnia had been brutal those first few months. I'd lie awake, replaying every moment of my marriage, looking for the exact point where it had gone wrong. The moment I could have fixed things, if only I'd been paying more attention. I'd imagine different choices, different conversations, different versions of us that might have worked. I'd torture myself with what-ifs and if-onlys until the sun came up and I had to drag myself through another day. Now, 10 years later, I slept well, peacefully, deeply. My bedroom in my little house was a sanctuary, decorated exactly how I liked it, with no one else's preferences to consider. I went to bed when I was tired and woke when I was rested, answerable to no one but myself. The contrast was stark. That woman who couldn't sleep had been fighting reality, resisting what had happened, trying to think her way back to a marriage that no longer existed. The woman I was now had accepted reality and made peace with it, and that acceptance had given me back my rest. But getting from there to here had taken years. The letter continued. "The kids are staying with Michael this week. The apartment is so quiet, I can hear the refrigerator humming from the bedroom. I've never lived alone before. I went from my parents' house to the dorm, to living with you, to our house. I don't know how to be alone. I don't know who I am without someone else defining me. I don't know who I am without someone else defining me." This paragraph hit hard because it articulated something I'd barely been able to admit at the time. I'd never learned to exist independently. My entire identity had been built in relation to others. Daughter, student, girlfriend, wife, mother. I'd moved from one role to another without ever pausing to ask who I was underneath all those roles. And when the wife role ended, when the mother role shifted, as my children grew up and needed me less, I'd been left with nothing solid to stand on, just a terrifying blank space where a self should have been. Learning to be alone had been the first and hardest lesson of my post-divorce life. That apartment I'd moved into, the one that felt so quiet and empty, had become my training ground. At first, the silence was oppressive. I'd fill it with television or music or phone calls, anything to avoid being alone with my own thoughts. But gradually, over months and then years, I'd started to appreciate the silence, to find it peaceful rather than threatening, to use it as space to hear my own voice, figure out my own preferences, discover who I was when no one else was watching. Now, 10 years later, I loved being alone. Not exclusively. I had friends and family and a full life. But I loved my solitude, my independence, my ability to spend time with myself without needing distraction or company. I discovered I was actually pretty good company, funny and thoughtful and creative in ways I'd never expressed during my marriage, because I'd been too focused on managing everyone else's needs and expectations. But that discovery had taken time, so much time. In the letter, I asked myself if I would ever be able to forgive. The answer to that question took years to arrive, and it didn't come in the way I expected. "Do you still hate him?" I'd written. "Do you still wake up angry, feeling like he stole your life, your future, everything you'd planned? Or have you forgiven him? Have you forgiven yourself? Can you think about those 18 years without wanting to erase them, without feeling like they were a waste?" The anger had been real and consuming those first few years. I'd been furious at Michael for giving up, for moving on so quickly, for seemingly suffering so little while I was drowning. I'd been angry at myself for not seeing the problem sooner, for not fighting harder, for failing to keep my marriage together. I'd been angry at the universe for the unfairness of it all, for letting me believe I built something permanent when it was actually so fragile. That anger had been justified, but it had also been exhausting and ultimately pointless. It hadn't changed anything. It hadn't brought Michael back, or fixed the marriage, or undone the divorce. It had just kept me trapped in the past, reliving the pain over and over, unable to move forward. Forgiveness had come slowly, in layers. First, I'd had to forgive Michael for being human, for falling out of love, for not being able to force himself to feel something he no longer felt. That hadn't meant excusing everything he'd done or agreeing that his choices were all reasonable. But it meant accepting that he'd done the best he could with the emotional capacity he had, just as I had. Neither of us had set out to fail at marriage. We'd just grown in different directions, wanted different things, become incompatible in ways neither of us had been mature enough to address until it was too late. Forgiving myself had been harder. I'd held on to so much shame about the divorce, so much self-blame. If only I'd been a better wife, more attentive, more interesting, more something, maybe he would have stayed. If only I'd noticed the distance growing sooner. If only I'd insisted on counseling earlier. If only I'd been different, better, more. It had taken years and a good therapist to help me understand that the marriage ending wasn't a failure of my worth as a person. It was just the natural conclusion of a relationship that had run its course. Some marriages last forever. Some don't. That doesn't make the people in them failures. It just makes them human beings trying their best in complicated situations. Now, 10 years later, I could think about my marriage with something close to fondness. Not for all of it. There had been pain and disappointment and years of slow dissolution. But there had also been real love, real joy, real partnership for at least some of those 18 years. I'd learned things in that marriage, grown in ways I wouldn't have otherwise. And most importantly, that marriage had given me my 2 children, who I loved more than anything. The 18 years hadn't been a waste. They'd been part of my journey, part of the story that made me who I was. I didn't wish them away anymore. I didn't wake up angry anymore. I'd forgiven Michael, forgiven myself, and found a way to be grateful for what we'd had, while also being grateful it ended when it did. But that forgiveness had taken 5 years to even begin, and probably another 3 to fully settle into. It wasn't a decision I'd made once. It was a practice I'd returned to again and again, choosing forgiveness over resentment, acceptance over bitterness, peace over anger. A letter went on. The kids are angry with me. Emma especially. She thinks I gave up too easily, that I should have tried harder. She's 19 and still believes in perfect love and forever marriages. She doesn't understand yet that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes 2 people can love each other and still not be able to make it work. I don't know how to explain this to her. I don't know how to help her through this when I can barely get through it myself. Reading this section made my heart ache for both versions of me. The one who'd written it, worried about her daughter and feeling like she'd failed her. And the one reading it now, knowing how that relationship had evolved over the decade that followed. Emma's anger had been real and had lasted longer than I'd hoped. For the first few years after the divorce, she'd been cold toward me, clearly blaming me more than her father for the family breaking apart. She'd been daddy's girl, always, and Michael had somehow become the victim in her narrative, the one who'd been left, even though the decision to divorce had been mutual. Or maybe she'd blamed me because she lived with me more in those early years, and I was the safer target for her rage and grief. It had hurt deeply to be going through the hardest thing I'd ever experienced while also losing my daughter's affection, having her pull away right when I needed her most. There had been many nights I'd cried myself to sleep, feeling like I'd lost everything: my marriage, my identity, and now my relationship with my child. But slowly, over years, things had shifted. Emma had gone through her own relationship struggles in her 20s, a serious boyfriend who'd broken her heart, a 2 engagement that fell apart, her own journey of learning that love was more complicated than she'd thought at 19. And as she'd gained her own experience with heartbreak and difficult relationships, she'd started to understand what I'd been going through, started to see me as a person rather than just as her mother, as someone who'd been hurting and doing her best, rather than someone who'd carelessly destroyed the family. We'd had a breakthrough conversation about 3 years ago when Emma was 26 and had just ended her engagement She'd come to visit me, and we'd stayed up late drinking wine and talking honestly in a way we never had before. She'd apologized for how she'd treated me after the divorce, for the years of coldness and judgment. She'd said she finally understood that I'd been trying to survive, that leaving the marriage had taken courage rather than weakness, that staying would have been worse for everyone in the long run. I'd cried hearing her say those words, cried with relief and joy and the release of years of guilt and grief over our damaged relationship. We'd hugged for a long time, both of us crying, and something had healed between us that night. Not completely. There were still scars, still complicated feelings, but we'd found our way back to each other. She was 29 now, and our relationship was better than it had ever been. Close, honest, built on mutual respect rather than just obligation. My son Jake's journey had been different but equally important. He'd been 17 when we divorced, angry in his own way, but also mature enough to understand that staying in an unhappy marriage wouldn't have served anyone. He divided his time between Michael and me fairly evenly, maintained good relationships with both of us, refused to take sides. I'd appreciated his maturity, even while wishing he didn't have to be so mature, wishing he could have had a few more years of childhood before being forced to navigate divorced parents and split households. Now he was 27, married himself to a wonderful woman, expecting his first child, my first grandchild. He'd told me recently that watching my journey over the past 10 years, seeing me rebuild my life and find happiness again, had taught him important things about resilience and the courage to make hard choices. He said he hoped if he ever found himself in an unhappy marriage, he'd have the strength to do what was best, even if it was hard. Just like I had. Hearing him say that had been one of the most healing moments of the past decade. To know that my children had learned something valuable from this experience, rather than just being damaged by it. To know they saw me as someone who'd handled a difficult situation with grace, rather than someone who'd failed them. That meant everything. But getting to that point had required years of patience, of showing up consistently for my kids, even when they were angry with me, of being honest about my struggles while also being a stable presence they could count on. It hadn't been easy. There had been many times I'd felt like I was failing them, like the divorce had irreparably damaged them. But somehow, we'd all made it through to the other side. The next part of the letter said, I don't know what to do with myself. I go to work, come home, sit in this apartment. I have no hobbies, no passions, nothing I do just for me. I realize now that I've spent 18 years organizing my life around Michael and the kids, and I have no idea what I actually enjoy when I'm not taking care of someone else. This had been one of my biggest realizations in those early months. I'd completely lost myself in the roles of wife and mother. Not in the beautiful, sacrificial way people sometimes talk about, but in an unhealthy way, where I'd stopped having preferences, opinions, interests of my own. I couldn't even answer simple questions like what kind of food I liked or what I wanted to do on a weekend, because I'd spent so many years deferring to Michael's preferences, or planning around the kids' activities. Rediscovering myself had been a long, sometimes painful, often surprising process. I'd started small, trying new things just to see what resonated. I'd taken a pottery class and discovered I loved working with clay, loved the meditative quality of shaping something with my hands. I joined a book club and remembered how much I enjoyed reading and discussing ideas with other people. I'd started hiking, something I'd done occasionally with Michael, but had stopped because he'd lost interest, and realized I actually preferred hiking alone at my own pace with space to think. Over the years, I'd accumulated a whole collection of interests and hobbies that were genuinely mine. I'd started volunteering at an animal shelter and discovered a deep satisfaction in caring for rescue dogs. I'd taught myself to paint, not well, but well enough to enjoy it. I'd started traveling, taking solo trips to places I'd always wanted to see, learning to be comfortable exploring new places alone. I'd joined a women's running group and made friends who knew me as Emily the runner, Emily the person, not Emily the divorced woman or Emily defined by any relationship. Each of these discoveries had been a small piece of rebuilding my sense of self. Each one had added dimension and color to my life, made me more interesting to myself, gave me things to look forward to and be excited about. By the time I was 50, I was a fully realized person with a rich internal life and varied interests. Not the empty shell I'd felt like at 42. But it had taken the entire decade to get there. The first few years, I'd still been floundering, trying things half-heartedly, not sure what I was looking for or whether I'd recognize it when I found it. It wasn't until around year 5 that I'd started to feel solid in my own identity, comfortable in my own skin, excited about my own life, rather than just surviving through each day. The letter continued with a question that made me pause. Will I ever love someone again? Will anyone ever want me? A divorced woman in her 40s, with baggage and kids and so much fear. I can't imagine it right now. The thought of dating, of being vulnerable with someone new, of risking this kind of pain again, it terrifies me. But I also can't imagine being alone for the rest of my life. What if I am, though? What if Michael was my one chance at love, and I've lost it? I sat with this paragraph for a long time, remembering how real those fears had been. The terror of aging alone, of never experiencing romance or partnership again, of being permanently single in a world that seemed designed for couples. I'd watched Michael move seamlessly into a new relationship while I'd felt completely undesirable, convinced that no one would want me with all my emotional wounds and complications. The answer to those questions had surprised me. Yes, I'd loved again, but not in the way or timeline I'd expected. I hadn't dated for the first 3 years after the divorce. I'd been too raw, too broken, too focused on just surviving and figuring out who I was alone. Friends had tried to set me up, suggesting dating apps or blind dates, but I'd refused every offer. I hadn't been ready. The thought of being intimate with someone new, of letting someone see me vulnerable, of opening myself up to potential rejection or hurt. It had felt impossible. But around year 4, something had shifted. I'd healed enough that loneliness became more prominent than fear. I'd missed companionship, conversation, touch, the particular intimacy that comes from romantic partnership. So I'd cautiously started dating. It had been awkward and often disappointing. Bad first dates, men who were clearly not over their ex-wives, men who had unrealistic expectations or incompatible values, or just didn't click with me. I'd gone through several brief relationships that fizzled out for various reasons. Each failure had stung, had brought back some of that old fear that maybe I was damaged or too difficult or simply unlucky in love. But I'd persisted, and eventually, about 6 years after my divorce, I'd met David. A widower in his early 50s, kind and thoughtful and genuinely interested in building a partnership. We dated for a year, taking things slowly, both of us cautious because of our past hurts. And it had been good, really good. Not the passionate, consuming love of youth, but something steadier, more mature, built on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. We'd eventually moved in together. Oh, we'd chosen not to remarry. Neither of us felt the need for that particular legal binding again. What we had was enough. Shared life, shared home, shared commitment, without the need for a wedding or official papers. We'd been together for almost 4 years now, and it was the healthiest relationship I'd ever been in. But even if I hadn't met David, even if I'd remained single, I'd learned something important. Being alone wasn't the tragedy I'd feared at 42. I'd built a full, satisfying life on my own first, before David came into it. And that meant I was with him because I wanted to be, not because I needed him to complete me or rescue me from loneliness. I was choosing partnership from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. That younger version of me who'd written the letter couldn't have imagined that. She'd been so afraid of permanent solitude that she couldn't see how valuable learning to be alone would be. Couldn't understand that the only way to healthy partnership was through first learning to be whole on her own. A letter went on, and the handwriting got messier here, like I'd been crying while I wrote. I feel like I've failed at the most important thing. Everyone gets married and stays married, or so it seems. I'm the only divorced person in my friend group. I'm embarrassed. I feel like I have a scarlet letter, like everyone is judging me, pitying me, gossiping about what went wrong. I hate going to couple events now. I hate being the odd one out. I hate explaining why I'm alone. I'm so tired of feeling ashamed. The shame had been crushing in those early years. Divorce still carried stigma, still felt like public failure, still marked you as damaged or difficult or deficient in some way. I'd felt it in the way some married friends had slowly drifted away, as if divorce were contagious. I'd felt it in the pitying looks, the awkward questions, the way conversations would sometimes halt when I entered a room, clearly having been about me. I'd internalized that shame deeply. I'd felt like I'd failed not just at marriage, but at being a proper adult woman. Like I'd broken some unspoken contract with society about how life was supposed to go. The shame had colored everything, made me apologetic about my existence, reluctant to take up space or assert my needs or expect anything good. Learning to release that shame had been crucial to my healing. It had required reframing the divorce from a personal failure to simply an outcome. something that happened but didn't define my worth. It had required recognizing that many people divorce, that it's a common human experience, that it didn't make me special or particularly tragic or uniquely broken. It had required building new friendships with people who didn't know married me, who only knew divorced me and liked me just fine as I was. By year 5 or 6, the shame had largely dissipated. I'd stopped apologizing for my marital status, stopped feeling like I needed to explain or justify what had happened. I was divorced. That was a fact about me, like having brown hair or being left-handed. It wasn't good or bad, it just was. And anyone who judged me for it wasn't someone whose opinion mattered. Now, at 52, I couldn't even access that old shame when I tried. It felt foreign, like an emotion belonging to a different person. I was proud of who I'd become, grateful for the journey that had shaped me, including the divorce. The shame that had seemed so permanent and defining had turned out to be temporary and irrelevant. But getting there had required years of work, of therapy, of conscious reframing, of building a life I was proud of regardless of my marital status. The next section of the letter was about money. I am terrified about finances. The divorce settlement seemed fair when we signed it, but now I'm looking at my budget and panicking. I've never managed money on my own. Michael always handled it. I don't know how I'm going to afford this apartment, pay my bills, save for retirement, help the kids with college. I feel financially incompetent and scared. What if I can't make it work? What if I end up destitute because I don't know what I'm doing? The financial fear had been very real. During my marriage, I'd worked and earned my own income, but Michael had managed our joint finances. He'd paid bills, made investment decisions, handled our budget. I'd had access to money, but not real understanding of how it all worked. And suddenly, at 42, I was solely responsible for my financial life and had no idea where to start. I'd made mistakes at first, spent too much on things I didn't need because I was trying to make myself feel better, failed to budget properly, and ended up short at the end of the month, made poor investment decisions because I didn't understand the options. The learning curve had been steep and occasionally painful, but I'd educated myself. I'd read books about personal finance, taken a financial literacy class at the community college, hired a financial advisor for a few sessions to help me understand the basics. I'd created budgets and tracked my spending and learned to live within my means. I'd made smart choices about my career, asking for raises when appropriate, taking on additional responsibilities that increased my value, changing jobs once for better pay and opportunities. By year 3, I'd felt competent with money. By year 5, I'd actually felt confident, like I knew what I was doing and could handle whatever financial challenges arose. Now, at year 10, I was financially stable, even comfortable. I had savings, retirement accounts that were growing, a house I'd bought on my own that was slowly building equity. I'd done it. I'd become financially independent and literate, skills I'd never developed during my marriage because I'd let someone else handle that part of life. And there was something deeply empowering about financial competence. It meant I knew I could take care of myself, that I wasn't dependent on anyone else for survival or security. It meant I made choices based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford in relation to a partner's income. It meant I was truly independent in a way I'd never been before. But that younger version of me, the one who wrote the letter, had been right to be scared. It had been hard. There had been months where money was tight, where I'd had to make difficult choices and sacrifices. The path to financial stability hadn't been smooth or easy, but I'd walked it, learned what I needed to learn, and come out the other side, capable and confident. Near the end of the letter, the tone shifted slightly. I want to believe it gets better. People keep telling me it does. You'll get through this, they say. Time heals. You'll be stronger for it. Right now, I can't see it. Right now, it feels like the pain will never end, like I'll be this broken forever. But I'm writing this letter because some tiny part of me, some small, stubborn part that refuses to completely give up, thinks maybe they're right. Maybe future me is okay. Maybe she's even happy. I can't imagine it, but I want to believe it's possible. Reading these words, I had to stop and cry. Not sad tears, but tears of recognition and gratitude and overwhelming relief, because that tiny, stubborn part of me that had held on to hope had been right. It did get better. Time did heal, though not in the simple, linear way people suggested. I was stronger for it, though not in the way I'd expected. The pain had ended, or at least transformed, into something I could carry without being crushed by it. I was okay. More than okay. I was genuinely, authentically happy in a way I'd never been during my marriage. Maybe in a way I'd never been in my entire life before the divorce. Not happy every moment of every day. That wasn't realistic, but happy in the deep, settled way that comes from living authentically, from knowing yourself, from building a life that actually fits who you are, rather than trying to force yourself to fit someone else's vision. That woman who'd written the letter couldn't have imagined the life I was living now. The little house I loved, with its garden I tended and rooms I decorated exactly how I liked. The relationship with David that was partnership without control, intimacy without loss of self. The friendships I'd built with people who knew and liked the real me. The hobbies and interests that brought me joy. The relationship with my children that had deepened and matured into genuine adult friendships. The career I'd grown and developed in directions I'd never considered during my marriage. The confidence and self-knowledge I'd gained through being forced to figure out who I was on my own. The last lines of the letter were almost hard to read through my tears. If you're reading this, future me, I hope you've made it to somewhere better. I hope you've figured out how to be happy again. I hope you've forgiven yourself and him. I hope you've learned to sleep again, to laugh again, to feel like life is worth living. I hope you remember that this dark moment isn't forever, even though it feels like it is. I hope you're proud of yourself for surviving. I hope you know that this version of you, writing in the middle of the night, in this lonely apartment, I'm trying my best. I'm doing everything I can to become you. I'm holding on because I want to meet you someday. I want to see who you become. Please be worth it. Please be happy. please be okay. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest, sobbing in my attic, overwhelmed by love for that earlier version of myself. She'd been so scared, so broken, so lost. But she'd also been so brave. She'd held on when it seemed pointless. She'd kept going when every day felt impossible. She'd done the work of healing, even when she couldn't see where it was leading. She'd built me, this current version, through sheer, stubborn persistence and hope that felt foolish, but turned out to be justified. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, yes, you make it. You become someone you're proud of. You build a life you love. You find happiness that's real and deep and sustainable. Every day you survive, every small choice you make to keep going, every moment of hope you manage to hold on to, it's building towards something beautiful. You can't see it yet, but I'm here. I'm the proof. You're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to be genuinely, surprisingly, wonderfully happy. But I couldn't tell her that. She had to walk the path without knowing where it led. She had to face each day's challenges without the assurance that it would all work out. She had to hope without certainty, trust without proof, keep going without guarantee. And she did. She did all of that. She became me. I carried the letter downstairs and placed it carefully in a drawer in my bedroom, a place where I could find it again when I needed the reminder of how far I'd come, because there would be hard days still. Days when I struggled or doubted or felt uncertain about my choices. On those days, I'd need to remember this, that I'd survived the unsurvivable, that I'd rebuilt from absolute devastation, that I'd transformed the worst period of my life into the foundation for the best version of myself. The divorce that had felt like the end had actually been a beginning. An unwanted, painful, traumatic beginning, yes, but a beginning nonetheless. It had forced me to become a whole person rather than half of a couple. It had taught me resilience and self-reliance and the ability to sit with discomfort. I wouldn't wish divorce on anyone. I wouldn't choose to go through it again if I could avoid it. The pain had been real and terrible and had shaped me in ways that still showed in my scars. But I also wouldn't undo it now if I could, because undoing the divorce would mean undoing everything I've learned and everyone I'd become. It would mean staying in that marriage that was slow death, that emptiness, pretending to be partnership. It would mean never discovering who I actually was underneath all my roles and obligations. The woman I was at 52 was someone the woman at 42 couldn't have imagined. I was stronger, wiser, more confident, more self-aware. I knew myself in ways I never had during my marriage. I had boundaries and preferences and opinions and interests that were genuinely mine. I had built a life from scratch that reflected my values and brought me genuine satisfaction. And I'd done it all starting from that dark moment when I'd written that letter, certain my life was over. Terrified I wouldn't survive, but holding on to a tiny thread of hope that somehow, impossibly, I might find my way to okay. I had found my way to more than okay. I'd found my way to happy. And that younger version of me, the one who'd held on when it seemed pointless, she deserved all the credit for making this possible. Later that evening, David came home from work and found me sitting at the kitchen table with red eyes and a soft smile. "You okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. "I'm perfect," I said. "I found a letter I wrote to myself 10 years ago, right after the divorce." He sat down across from me, taking my hand. That must have been hard to read. It was, but also beautiful. It reminded me how far I've come, how much I've grown, how worth it all of this was. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. "Maybe later," I said. "Right now, I just want to sit here and feel grateful for this life, for becoming who I am, for all of it, even the painful parts that got me here." He squeezed my hand, understanding without needing more explanation. That was the kind of partner he was, the kind of relationship we had, built on a foundation of two whole people who'd both been through hard things and come out the other side, knowing themselves and what they needed. That night, lying in bed next to David, I thought about that letter one more time. Thought about what I'd want to tell that earlier version of myself if I could. ... I'd tell her that the pain is temporary, even though it feels permanent. That healing takes longer than anyone says, but happens more completely than you dare hope. That you'll discover strength you didn't know you had, and resources you didn't know you possessed. That you'll survive this because you're tougher than you think, more resilient than you believe, more capable than you've been given credit for. I'd tell her that the life waiting on the other side of this darkness is better than anything you had before. Not because it's objectively perfect, but because it's genuinely yours. That you'll learn to be alone and discover it's not the curse you feared, but actually a gift. That you'll learn to be yourself and discover you're more interesting and capable than you'd been allowed to be in a relationship where you made yourself small. I'd tell her that yes, you'll love again, but more importantly, you'll learn to love yourself. You'll learn to be your own best friend, your own support system, your own source of comfort and strength. And that self-love will be the foundation for everything else that's good in your life. I tell her that the children will be okay, better than okay. They'll learn important lessons from watching you navigate this crisis with grace and determination. They'll see that hard things can be survived, that change doesn't have to destroy you, that sometimes the bravest thing is admitting something isn't working and having the courage to start over. Emma will come around. Jake will understand. Your relationship with them will deepen in ways that wouldn't have been possible if you'd stayed in that hollow marriage, modeling unhappiness and calling it commitment. I'd tell her that the shame will fade. The embarrassment of being divorced in a world that still judges it will lose its power over you. You'll stop seeing yourself through other people's eyes and start seeing yourself through your own. and what you'll see. I'd tell her that the insomnia will end. The silence that terrifies you now will become your favorite thing. The apartment that feels like a prison will become your sanctuary. The loneliness that feels unbearable will transform into solitude you cherish. Every single thing that seems impossible now will become not just possible, but good. I tell her that hobbies and interests you don't even know you have are waiting to be discovered. That you'll try new things and fail at some and succeed at others and enjoy the process of exploration. That you'll make new friends who see you as a whole person rather than as half of a couple. That you'll travel to places you've always wanted to go, learn skills you've always been curious about, become the version of yourself that marriage never had room for. I'd tell her that the healing isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. Days when you feel strong and days when you feel broken all over again. Days when you're grateful for the divorce and days when you miss what you lost, even knowing it wasn't working. Days when you're confident about your future and days when you're terrified. And all of that is okay. All of that is part of the process. Healing doesn't mean never hurting again. It means learning to hold the hurt without being consumed by it. I'd tell her that therapy will help more than you expect. That talking to a professional who can offer perspective without judgment will be one of the smartest investments you make in yourself. That the work you do in those sessions will pay dividends for years. That learning to understand your patterns and beliefs and fears will give you tools for navigating not just the divorce, but everything else life throws at you. ... I tell her that some friendships won't survive this transition, and that's okay. People who were friends with your marriage rather than friends with you will fall away, and it will hurt. But it will also create space for better, truer friendships. You'll discover who your real friends are, the ones who show up when things are hard, the ones who love you regardless of your marital status. Those friendships will become anchors. I'd tell her that dating again will be awkward and scary and sometimes disappointing, but also occasionally wonderful. That you'll learn things about yourself through the process of being vulnerable with new people. That you'll discover what you really need in a partner, what you can compromise on, and what's non-negotiable. That the relationship you'll eventually build will be healthier than your marriage because you'll enter it as a whole person rather than someone looking to be completed. I'd tell her that the version of yourself you'll become is someone your current self can't even imagine. That you'll develop confidence you've never had, pursue interests you've never explored, set boundaries you've never known you needed. That you'll learn to advocate for yourself, to ask for what you want, to walk away from what doesn't serve you. That you'll become, finally and fully, yourself. I'd tell her that 10 years will pass faster than she thinks. That on the other side of those years, she'll look back at this moment and feel compassion for the woman she was, but also pride in how she handled it. That she'll read the letter she's writing now and cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude for the journey and relief that the worst is over. But most of all, I'd tell her this: you are enough. Right now, in this dark moment, feeling broken and lost and convinced you'll never be whole again. You are enough. You don't need to be fixed or rescued or saved by someone else. You just need time and patience and the willingness to keep going one day at a time. The strength you need is already inside you, even if you can't feel it yet. The woman you're meant to become is already there, waiting to emerge. Trust the process. Trust yourself. Keep going, because I know something she doesn't. She makes it. She survives. She rebuilds. She thrives. She becomes me, sitting here 10 years later, reading her letter with tears and gratitude and absolute certainty that every single painful step was worth it. The next morning, I woke early and went for my usual run. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I ran my familiar route, feet hitting the pavement in a steady rhythm, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling strong and alive and grateful. This was my life now. These small rituals that brought me peace. This body that I'd learned to care for and appreciate. This mind that I'd trained to focus on gratitude rather than resentment. This heart that had broken and healed and learned to love again, both myself and others. None of this would have been possible if my marriage hadn't ended. I wouldn't have discovered running if I hadn't needed a way to process the grief and anger of divorce. I wouldn't have built this morning ritual if I hadn't been living alone and learning to structure my days around my own needs. I wouldn't have this particular body, strong and capable from years of self-care, if I hadn't had to learn to nurture myself when no one else was going to do it. The divorce had forced me to become the person I'd always had the potential to be, but had never actualized. It had stripped away everything comfortable and familiar and left me with just myself, requiring me to discover whether that self was enough to build a life on. And it turned out she was. I was. When I got home from my run, I made coffee and sat on my back porch, looking at the garden I'd planted and tended over the past few years. Tomatoes were ripening on the vine. Flowers I'd chosen for their color and scent were blooming enthusiastically. Herbs I used for cooking were thriving in their raised beds. This garden, like so much of my life now, was exactly what I wanted it to be. No one else's preferences to consider, no compromises to make. Just me, creating beauty and bounty according to my own vision. I thought about the word that kept coming up as I reflected on the past decade: authenticity. That's what I'd gained through the divorce and the hard years that followed. The ability and willingness to live authentically, to be genuinely myself rather than performing a role or meeting someone else's expectations. During my marriage, I'd performed the role of wife and mother competently but not authentically. I'd done what I thought I was supposed to do, behaved how I thought I was supposed to behave, wanted what I thought I was supposed to want. But underneath all that performance, there had been a real person with different desires and preferences and needs. A person I didn't know because I'd never given her space to emerge. The divorce had destroyed the performance and forced the real person to surface. At first, I hadn't known who that person was. I'd felt formless, undefined, uncertain of my own preferences and desires because I'd spent so long suppressing them. But gradually, through trial and error and lots of therapy and the simple passage of time, I'd discovered her, discovered me, and I liked her. I liked the person I'd become. She was braver than I'd expected, more resilient, more interesting. She had opinions and passions and boundaries. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to ask for it. She could be alone without being lonely. She could love without losing herself. She was whole. That wholeness was the real gift of the divorce. Not the pain or the loss or the years of struggle, but the wholeness that emerged on the other side of all that. A sense of being integrated, authentic, fully myself in a way I'd never been before. David came out onto the porch, carrying his own coffee, and sat beside me. We didn't talk, just sat together in comfortable silence, watching the morning unfold. This was another thing I'd learned, that intimacy didn't require constant conversation or entertainment, that two people could simply be together, enjoying shared space without needing to perform connection. "I love you," he said eventually, simply. "I love you too," I replied, and I meant it, but with a depth of meaning I couldn't have accessed in my first marriage. Because this love was built on a foundation of self-love and self-knowledge. This love was a choice I made from wholeness, rather than a need arising from emptiness. This love enhanced my life rather than defining it. If I'd never been divorced, I wouldn't know how to love like this. I'd still be stuck in the pattern of losing myself in relationship, of making myself small to accommodate someone else, of seeking completion rather than offering companionship between two complete people. Later that day, Emma called, just to check in, she said, though I suspected she'd been thinking about me after our conversation last week when I'd mentioned finding old boxes in the attic. "Did you find anything interesting?" she asked. "Actually, yes. I found a letter I wrote to myself right after the divorce. It was intense to read. I can imagine. Was it hard? It was, but also good. It reminded me how far I've come, how much I've changed and grown." There was a pause. Then Emma said quietly, "Mom, I want to apologize again for how I treated you back then. Reading about your pain, even just hearing you reference it, reminds me how awful I was. How much I added to what you were going through. Emma, you were 19. You were hurting too. You didn't have the tools to handle it better. I understand that. I know you do. That's what makes me feel worse. You understood even then, even while I was being terrible to you. You just kept showing up, being patient, waiting for me to come around." "That's what parents do," I said simply. "Not all parents. You could have gotten defensive or angry or distant. But you didn't. You stayed open and available even when I was closed off. That took strength I didn't appreciate at the time. It took desperation too," I admitted. "I couldn't bear the thought of losing you along with everything else. Even if you were angry with me, at least you were still in my life. That was enough. I'm glad it was. And I'm glad we made it through to here. Our relationship now, it's the best it's ever been, Mom. Better than when I was a kid. More honest, more real." I agree. And that's something that came out of the divorce. We wouldn't have this relationship if everything had stayed the same. After we hung up, I sat with the gift of that conversation. The fact that Emma could reflect on that time, acknowledge her role, appreciate mine, and recognize the growth we both done. That was healing in itself. It confirmed that the hard years had been worth it, that the patience I'd practiced had paid off, that the relationship I'd been terrified of losing had actually deepened through the crisis. That evening, I pulled out the letter again and read it one more time. But this time, instead of just reading it, I wrote a response. Not the response I'd wanted to tell that earlier version of myself, but the response I actually would have needed to hear. Dear past me, I wrote, I received your letter today, 10 years after you wrote it. And I want you to know you did it. You survived. You became okay. You became happy. Every fear you had turned out to be less terrible than you imagined. Every hope you held on to, even the ones that felt foolish, turned out to be justified. The journey was hard. Harder than I can really convey, even though I lived it. There were moments I wanted to give up, days I wasn't sure I could keep going, setbacks that felt like they'd destroyed all my progress. But I kept going anyway. You kept going. And that persistence paid off in ways you can't imagine yet. You asked if you'd ever forgive him, forgive yourself, stop feeling ashamed. The answer is yes, though it took years. Forgiveness came in layers, each one revealing deeper understanding. The shame faded as I built a life I was proud of. The anger transformed into acceptance, and eventually into something like gratitude. You asked if you'd ever love again. Yes, but more importantly, you learned to love yourself. That turned out to be the foundation for everything else. You asked if the kids would be okay. They are. Better than okay. Your relationship with them deepened and matured in ways that wouldn't have been possible if you'd stayed married and miserable. You were terrified of being alone, of never figuring out who you were without someone else defining you. But being alone turned out to be the greatest gift. It forced you to discover yourself, to develop interests and strengths and capabilities you never knew you had. You built a whole, integrated self instead of remaining half of a couple. The financial fears were real, but you handled them. You learned what you needed to learn. You became competent and confident. You built security for yourself. Everything you thought would destroy you actually transformed you. The worst period of your life became the foundation for the best version of yourself. The ending you were so afraid of turned out to be a beginning. I'm proud of you, proud of your courage in writing this letter at all, in holding on to hope when it seemed pointless, in asking these questions even though you were terrified of the answers. You were braver than you knew, and I want you to know that your stubbornness, your refusal to completely give up even in your darkest moment, that saved us. That tiny thread of hope you clung to was enough. It kept you going until you could heal. It brought us here, to this life we live now, this person we've become. You're worth it. You were always worth it. The pain, the growth, the long journey from there to here, all of it was worth it. Because we ended up somewhere better than you could have imagined. Somewhere real and authentic and genuinely happy. Thank you for holding on. Thank you for hoping. Thank you for becoming me. With love and gratitude, future you. I folded both letters together and put them back in my drawer. Someday, maybe when I was going through another difficult transition, I'd need to read them again, to remember that I'd survived seemingly unsurvivable pain before, that I'd rebuilt from devastation before, that I had a track record of handling hard things and coming out the other side, not just intact, but improved. But for now, I was content to simply live the life those hard years had built, to appreciate the peace and authenticity and wholeness I'd fought so hard to create, to be grateful for every single step of the journey, even the painful ones, because they'd all been necessary to get here. The divorce that had felt like the end of my life had actually been the beginning of it. The real beginning, when I finally started living as myself, rather than as someone else's partner or someone else's version of who I should be. Everything before had been practice, preparation, learning the hard way, what I didn't want, so I could eventually discover what I did. I was 52 years old, divorced for 10 years, remarried in all but legal paperwork, in a relationship with my children that was honest and close, financially stable, professionally satisfied, physically healthy, emotionally balanced, living in a home I loved, pursuing interests that brought me joy, connected to a community that supported me, at peace with my past and optimistic about my future. That woman at 42, sitting in her apartment at 2 a.m. writing a desperate letter, couldn't have imagined this life. She couldn't have imagined becoming this person. But she'd held on anyway. She'd hoped anyway. She'd kept going anyway. And that had made all the difference. 10 years after my divorce, I found the letter I wrote to myself in my darkest hour. And reading it, I understood something profound. The most important person who'd been there for me through everything, who'd never given up on me, who'd believed in my potential even when I couldn't see it, was me, past me, holding on for future me, working every day to create the life I now lived, refusing to let despair win, refusing to stop fighting, refusing to believe the darkness was permanent. I owed her everything. That woman in the letter, broken and scared and writing by the light of her kitchen lamp in the middle of the night. She'd saved my life by simply refusing to give up on it. She'd built my future by believing it could exist, even when she couldn't see how. And now I got to live that future, got to be the answer to her desperate questions, got to be the proof that she'd been right to hold on, right to hope, right to believe that somehow, impossibly, things could get better. They did get better, so much better than either of us could have imagined. And if that earlier version of me could do it, if she could walk through that darkness and come out into light, then I could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Because I knew now, with certainty that came from lived experience, that I was capable of surviving hard things, that I could adapt and learn and grow and rebuild, that endings weren't the catastrophes I'd feared, but opportunities for new beginnings. The letter had been a gift from past me to future me, a message in a bottle thrown into an uncertain sea, hoping it would someday reach safe shores. And it had. I'd received it, 10 years later, living proof that the hope it contained had been warranted. Now, sitting in my peaceful home, in my carefully built life, with my hard-won wisdom and self-knowledge, I felt only gratitude for the journey, for the growth, for the woman I'd been, and the woman I'd become, for the pain that had forced transformation, for the darkness that had taught me to appreciate light, for the loss that had made room for gain. I'd survived my divorce. I'd thrived after it. I'd become the person I was always meant to be, but couldn't become while trying to fit myself into someone else's vision. And that, finally and completely, was enough.